Today is June 7th, 2017. We are at the studio workplace, or home of Jesse Kreitzer. My name is Ben Kowalski. Today's production crew is on video camera, Roxanne Burt, on audio recorder, Roxanne Burt, and on still camera, Ritter Redfield.
I'll be back around 4:30.
Okay. Yeah. Alright. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background and then about your life as a filmmaker and an artist. Alright, so I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background now. Have you always lived in Marlboro?
I have always lived in Marlboro. Yeah, I'm the only one in my family who was born and raised here.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Brattleboro, but I grew up just about 3 miles down the road from where we are today.
Nice. Do you live in the same house you grew up in or in a different one?
Well, this is a different one, but again, yeah, it's only a few miles down the road from where I grew up. So I learned to swim at the Davison's Pond, which is right outside this house.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, this is a new home, but it feels very familiar, and it feels not just close to home, it feels like home.
Yeah. Aside from Marlboro, where else have you lived as an adult?
Well, after graduating from high school in Brattleboro and studying with Michelle Moise at the Center for Digital Art in Brattleboro, I went to Emerson College, that's in Boston, Massachusetts, and I studied filmmaking there for 4 years. And then I started working in the city of Newton, Massachusetts, producing television for the city and for the mayor and all of the municipal departments, and so I did that for about another 5 years, and then went and got my master's degree at the University of Iowa for 3 years. So it's been all told around 13 years since I've been away. I was away from Marlboro, and now I'm back.
Cool. May I ask how old you are now?
I'm 32.
You have one sibling. What is his name? Where does he live now? What is he doing in his life?
Yeah, my brother Zeke, my older brother, he's living in Brooklyn, New York, and he's a musician, an artist as well. And yeah, he's been living in New York for I think about 5 years now, and is producing music, and he's teaching music and video production in the schools there, and he's making it work.
What are your parents' names and what have been their careers? Where do they live?
My parents, my mom's name is Luann Kreitzer, and my dad's name is Bob Kreitzer. My mom is a nurse, and she was working in Townsend for many years at a private practice, and now she is working downtown at part of Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. And my father was a social worker working in social welfare and Medicare for the state of Vermont. And he's now retired and is a woodworker and a gardener and loves to bake breads and enjoying the life of a retired social worker.
Nice. What is your partner's name?
My partner's name is Alina Kolpavichute. She's Lithuanian. And we met in Boston, and we've been together for about 6 years, and we live here together.
Where is she from?
She's from Lithuania. She was born in Kaunas, Lithuania, and she goes back every year to visit her family, and I've had the luxury of going there with her and seeing the country, and I like it very much.
How did you two meet?
We met at a mutual friend's house and bonded over film festivals and filmmaking. So, I'd been making films, and she had been going to festivals for a good part of her life, and we bonded over that, and the rest is history.
What career has she been involved with?
Well, her background is in arts history. And that's in Lithuania, and in the States she's worked just about in every sort of industry you can imagine. So she was running an art gallery in Iowa City, she was doing photography, she was running an insurance office, now where she's working at international travel company. So she's done quite a bit over the last 6 years as we've been sort of going from Boston to Iowa back to Marlboro.
Cool. You attended at Marburg School when you were a child. Who were your teachers then?
I had a lot of teachers at Marlboro. Well, let's see, David Holzapfel, of course, John Esau, Peggy Tiffany, Tim Hayes, John Morris, Esther Fielding for kindergarten. Let's see, I think that might be it. Who am I leaving out? But
Alright. What were some of the qualities at Marlboro School that you feel are unique or that have been helpful to you in your education as life thus far?
yeah, my parents moved to Marlboro from New York in large part because of the reputation of the school, and I can attest to that. I've always had an interest in filmmaking and storytelling, image making, and I think Marlboro, my teachers and my parents recognized that at an early age, and so they put a camera in my hands and they encouraged me to tell stories and make images. And so I think, generally speaking, the school has a reputation for really encouraging and fostering everyone's individual interests, and not necessarily just sort of teaching for the test, as it were, but really supporting everyone's individual passions and encouraging them to pursue those.
Cool. What were some of the maybe not so great qualities
Of Marlboro?
and it says, what were some of the maybe not so great qualities
Maybe of the school, probably.
of the school? Yeah.
Not so great qualities. Well, maybe at the time I'm sure I had some sort of grievances over this or that, but I have to say I attribute a lot of my sort of tenacity and my conviction in pursuing the things that I love and the things that I'm passionate about. I attribute that to the school, and so that's sort of the narrative that that I continue to tell about the school. And so any of my past grievances, they certainly don't seem to have had a lasting effect. I don't have anything bad to say about Marlboro.
How would you describe yourself when you were a child?
I was very shy growing up. I don't think in private I was shy. I think at home I was very sort of free-spirited and playful, and I would perform. And then I think it wasn't until 4th grade at Marlboro where I was cast as Fagin in the play Oliver. And that was a big role, and I remember sort of going into the casting session and saying, I want to play this role. This was a bigger role, and I got it. I got the role. And I remember in 4th grade being cast as Fagin and sort of becoming uninhibited in that role. And when we performed on stage, I remember that for at least a lot of the sort of murmuring of some of the parents of my friends, they said, oh, I always thought he was so shy, and they sort of saw me sort of lighten up on stage. So introvert, extrovert, I can be very outgoing, and I also really love my solitude.
Yeah. What high school did you attend?
I went to Brattleboro Union High School.
What do you do in between high school and going to college? What did you do?
Well, I went straight from high school to college, although I did have the pleasure of working with Michelle Moise at the Center for Digital Art in Brattleboro, and that's where I really got my first professional exposure to filmmaking, film production. And so that was sort of a nice way to transition from high school to college. But I went straight to college after high school.
What colleges or universities have you attended?
I went to Emerson College for my undergraduate, where I studied visual and media arts and photography, still photography. And then I went to the University of Iowa, where I got a Master's of Fine Art in cinema and comparative literature.
What was your plan of study there?
There you go.
What you just said. What was your graduate degree project titled, and would you tell a bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, well, I moved to Iowa, for many reasons, but one of the determining factors was I had family ties to Iowa that I knew nothing about, really, on my mother's side of the family. I knew that my great-grandfather was a coal miner and in Iowa, and so that was, I had a real sort of desire to go and learn more about my mother's ancestry. Mm-hmm. And so I spent 3 years connecting with family and doing research about my mother's side of the family, and made a film called Black Canarys, which is a fictional story, but it's very much an ode to my ancestors, and loosely inspired by these oral histories that I collected about my family's history.
When did you begin to realize that you wanted to be a professional artist?
A professional artist. Well, I don't know what a professional artist is, or if you ever get to that point. But yeah, I have always been pursuing filmmaking. Whether you make a career out of it or not, it can be very challenging, and in large part that's why I got a master's degree, to be able to teach in terms of realistically how an artist, how a filmmaker can support oneself. But I've always been pursuing filmmaking, whether it was a professional trajectory or not. It was just something I was always very passionate about and felt this natural inclination, this desire to do.
What are some of the reasons why you moved back to Marlboro?
Well, I think as a filmmaker, as a visual storyteller, I need to be connected to the land that I'm telling stories. And so there's something about Vermont and the land specifically that just inspires me. And so whether it's the seasons or the back roads or the old farmhouses, maybe just because I have roots here, my childhood roots are here, there's a real sort of creative urge to create here. The film industry here, mm-hmm. But I also know that there's a story to be told here, and and I'm inspired by the land and its people here.
Mm-hmm. Have you always worked in film, or have you worked in other art forms also?
Well, no, mostly film and still photography, but filmmaking requires so much outside of just making images, so in some ways I consider myself a producer, which as I see that role is very much you're creating a whole world around a project and sort of connecting all of these people and organizations around a common cause. And so I've worked in the nonprofit sector and done a lot of client-based productions, and in some ways it requires that you facilitate, you sort of create something, you will it into existence, and that often means that you have to be very vocal and very forward and sort of moving and shaking to get things done.
What does one learn to be a filmmaker? How much did you learn in school, and how much through working with other filmmakers and on your own?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Yeah, well, I think film school can be very important. One, I mean, it just provides time, which is, I think, as an artist, the most valuable thing. School is a very privileged time to be able to create. But simultaneously, it's I find that, yeah, actually doing the work outside of what takes place in the classroom, you know, is in some ways far more valuable. I mean, school provides infrastructure, and it provides a framework, right, for people to create, and access to a network of other creators to challenge one another and to support one another, to commiserate. But I think I've learned, you know, so much more, frankly, from just going out there and doing it, and ultimately you learn quite a bit from what doesn't work, and you start to just respond to that based on, you know, your next project and and your past experiences and what has and has not worked. So.
With what other filmmakers have you studied or worked?
Well, Emerson College, I had, there was Rob Todd and Jonathan Schwartz, a graduate program studying under Jesse McLean, Sasha Waters-Fryer, let's see, other sort of, well, Michelle Moise, of course, and undergraduate work in high school. So all sorts of makers, and of course my peers too. Kelly Gallagher, Josh Yates, Kasia Plazhenska. These are filmmakers that I studied with. Emerson College, of course, incredibly talented filmmakers that have gone on to do some incredible work. So yeah, it's nice to be around other makers and you know, to be supported and to be challenged by them.
What filmmakers have been important to you, and do you feel have influenced your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly, I don't know if you've ever heard or seen any films of Ingmar Bergman, but yeah, well, Bergman, I didn't see a Bergman film until I was probably, I don't know, maybe 19 years old or so, but I had been making films, you know, since I was 15 or, you know, 8, you know, but it wasn't until I saw a Bergman film that I saw a filmmaker that I felt sort of tethered to. I mean, there was some intrinsic connection to Bergman and his films. So Bergman is a huge influence for me. Tarkovsky, a Russian filmmaker, again, he deals with a lot of stories of rural stories of the land. So Tarkovsky is incredibly influential for me. Jim Jarmusch, Spike Lee, the Coen brothers, these are sort of American independent auteurs that have also been very influential, I would say.
What is the name of your film company?
My film company is called Lanterna, and I've always, well, one, I've collected lanterns since I was young, but for me, if I think about the lantern and its relationship to the creative process, it's that generally it's a solitary craft. Yes, filmmaking is a very collaborative art and it requires a lot of people, but at the very beginning and generally at the very end, it feels like a very solitary, very quiet craft. Mm-hmm. And so the role of the lantern as someone who's holding it alone, navigating through the dark, I've always found to be a sort of suited visual metaphor for how I regard the creative process.
When did you establish it?
Professionally established right after I graduated my undergraduate, so it was 2000 and, let's see, 7? Or 2005-ish, I founded Lanterna.
Mm-hmm. How did you decide upon the name and what does it mean? Well, you already answered that. Alright, Have you yourself always made documentary film, or have you worked in other film genres too? If yes, what genres?
Yeah, I've made documentary films, all short form. I haven't made any feature-length works, but short documentaries, short narrative films. I've done some animation. So yeah, I enjoy working in both modes. It's just different processes, and in some ways it's just about what the story is. The content generally dictates how to tell the story. So I don't choose one form of working over another.
How do you decide what film to make?
Well, it sort of shows its cards to you. I mean, you always have an idea. You have so many ideas, right, of sort of stories that you would want to tell. And it's great to dream and think about, someday wanting to do this or that. But in some ways, you also have to be very realistic about, one, it's whether the work that you do is dictated by the place, so if I'm in Vermont now, how does that impact the films that I'm going to be making if I were in Iowa in a master's program or Boston? So I think in some ways the work is dictated by the place in which you reside, and then also just the sort of resources you have access to. So if you don't have a big budget, or you don't have infrastructure, personnel, crew to support your films, you have to be realistic about how do you work in that tradition. And so it seems like a very organic process in terms of when you know what story you should pursue next. And you can't really force that. It just I think it's something I can't really articulate in words, except you know when it's time to move forward on certain projects, and when others should probably will eventually manifest later.
What process do you undertake to decide what film to devote your time and energy to?
Yeah, again, I think it's really about place. So if I'm in Vermont, there's specifically a Vermont story that I've wanted to tell for a long time about caregiving, rural hospice volunteers. And so now that I'm back in Vermont, I've been focusing my energies on that. So it's time, just by the nature of having moved back to rural Vermont, and this is how I want to spend my time, by telling this story, which I've waited a long time to tell.
Do people come to visit, do people come to you with ideas also?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone has ideas about, stories they would want to tell or see. So, and especially in school, you're always, surrounded by other filmmakers that want to tell their stories. So, yeah, it's you're part of a filmmaking community of people that want to tell stories and are trying to get films off the ground. And so, I think other filmmakers rely on one another as sounding boards to be able to try to workshop their films, present rough cuts, or read scripts, whatever it may be. So yeah, there's always time and opportunity to talk about other people's work and their ideas.
Cool. Would you say something about the type of research that you conduct as you develop your films?
Well, a lot of my work is built around genealogical research, very sort of amateur genealogical research, but I need to, in some way, the work is connected to whether it's my own personal history, my family's history, or the land, the place where I'm developing the story. I find that that's a way in for me creatively. And so usually when I'm developing a project, I'm first just sort of foraging. I'm collecting all sorts of materials, visual materials, written texts, music, all sorts of materials that in some way are can inspire the work. And so I spend quite a bit of time just amassing this sort of treasure trove of archive materials, especially, whether it's photographs or music or writings, recording oral histories, interviews, just like this, to be able to start to understand the material.
What role does storytelling have in your ideas for making your film?
Yeah, well, it's certainly storytelling for me. It doesn't always work in a straight line. The sort of conventions of story, the once upon a time, and the 3-act structure, the sort of conventions of how we understand story. I don't always approach my work that way, to think about, my beginning, middle, and end. Sometimes it's a sound or an image, and then another sound and an image, and over a period of time you start to understand how these seemingly disparate sounds and images are related to one another. So sometimes that's how stories develop, and other times they are much more linear, or inspired by, in one case, the story of Alan Lomax. I made a film about him, and so that was a bit more conventional in its approach.
Would you give a brief overview of the entire process of making your film Black Canarys, from the first idea to the finished film?
Mm-hmm.
Not the content, but the process, please.
All right. Yeah, I'll try to do that in a nutshell, if I can.
It's like a simple one.
Yeah, I'll do my best. As I mentioned, I knew when I was going to Iowa that I would make this film. I knew I wanted to make a coal mining film. And the film would really be a byproduct, if anything, of the real joy, which was getting to know my family and seeing these relics of my great-grandfather, going through family photo archives and whatnot. So that was a real treat for 3 years before actually making the film. But in terms of what it took to make the film, just the process, the actual process of bringing this film to life, in some ways I'd say it started with a film tour. I needed to raise money, I knew that much. So I launched a 3-state tour in Iowa, Massachusetts, and Vermont, and I presented my short films and a 15-minute animatic, like an animated version of the film. I had a storyboard artist, Ben Mackey. He drew basically the entire film, and I made the film with still illustrations and sound design. And then I raised money, and I knew that I had to get cast and crew and locations and props and costumes, and it was a full-time job. 7 days a week. I was on the road quite a bit, location scouting and making phone calls and just insisting that there was a way to make the film, even though I knew it was very ambitious and had a lot of requirements and cost a lot of money. And so you just sort of put one foot in front of the next, but you're sort of guided by a conviction, that it will all come together.
Black Canarys has won numerous awards at film festivals. Would you give a brief summary of the content of the film?
Well, it's a fictional story, but again, it's inspired by the stories of my family's history. But it's a portrait of a mining family, the turn of the century mining family, and it's really a sort of a meditative, a lyrical, a very visual story about a family that's sort of not just connected to the land, but in some ways at the mercy of the land and of the coal mining trade. And so it's 3 generations, the grandfather, the father, and the son. And you see this lineage of coal miners and this tradition that's rooted in hardship and depression and poverty being passed down from generation to generation.
What role do festivals have in the careers of filmmakers?
Well, you know, it's one thing to make the film, but you're really only halfway there. Then you have to get it out, and people need to see it. And so film festivals play a really important role in providing not just a screen, but also an audience, and generally an audience that's passionate about films and filmmakers. So festivals just provide that platform for you to present your work, and generally in a nice big movie theater with a big picture and big sound, so you get to see it sort of as films I think are intended to be seen, you know, and presented on a big screen. So.
Would you give us a sense of what festivals are like and what they're like for you personally? Do you like them and enjoy the opportunity to speak at festivals, or would you rather not?
Well, it depends on the festival, I think. Generally, I find the best festivals, one, I'm biased of course, but one that treats its filmmakers and its volunteers really well. I find that that's a good place to start, that if you keep the volunteers and the filmmakers happy, and you fill up your theaters with passionate audience members, and just provide a place to sleep, that's generally good enough. But yeah, mixed feelings. Sometimes, you know, presenting your work in front of an audience, especially when you're exhausted by the work and you can't look at it again,
Yeah.
and then so to share it, you're ready to just move on to the next project, but it's an important part of getting the film out. So I think at festivals what I enjoy most is just meeting other filmmakers and being inspired by their work, and I think that's a big part of it. And then also, of course, being able to see parts of the world that you may never go to if it weren't for the film festival. So it provides a great opportunity to relax a little bit, hopefully, and also see parts of the world.
What film festivals have been successful for you? How do you determine success at a film festival?
Well, I won't name specific festivals, but what I will say is I think the most successful festivals are one where you feel, there's an audience, of course, right, that your work is presented well and properly. There's good sound, good image, and people are there, so that's great, of course. And that the programming is also just presented well, and you're excited and inspired to see new work that's coming out. So, and then also they provide a space for people to be open and honest and vulnerable and sort of let the guard down. I think there can be a tendency at festivals, certain festivals, where there's sort of a lot of ego, and there's people are sort of wearing a mask or a bit guarded. And so I really love sort of smaller festivals where it provides a space for filmmakers to sort of be much more honest and vulnerable about their work and the state of being an independent filmmaker in 2017.
What have been some of the personal highlights of your career thus far?
Well, I don't rest on laurels, and so personal highlights. Well, just recently I was honored by the Ashland Independent Film Festival in Ashland, Oregon, and I think they're just a wonderful festival. They were one of the first festivals that in some way sort of discovered me, or I had no name recognition or anything like that, and they found me and my film. So I credit the Ashland Independent Film Festival as playing a pretty big role, and so to be honored by them this past year was very special. And then also I was just honored by the Vermont International Film Foundation, and they gave me the James Goldstone Award for Emerging Vermont Filmmaker. So that was very special to come back home after 13 years and to be acknowledged in my home state. Also felt very special.
Sometimes artists need to have other jobs in order to make enough money to keep working as an artist. Teaching has been an important part of your professional life. Would you speak a little bit about the role that being a teacher has had in your career?
Yeah, I love the classroom and I love to teach, and if for nothing else, to just be to provide a space for other filmmakers, other storytellers to create. I find that's very rewarding. It's very challenging, but it's also, that's a part of my own creative process, to be around other creators and to constantly be learning and sort of digging into new material and introducing new films and new texts. And so the classroom is just a really wonderful space to be around, not just say other faculty, but the students as well, and to really challenge and encourage them to tell their stories.
Okay. How long did you teach at Burlington College before it had to close?
I was only there for about one academic year, about 10 months before it closed. But I had just wrapped my master's degree, and there are very few full-time faculty positions in Vermont in film, and so I thought it was a great opportunity, at least to just get me back east, and not just back east, but back to Vermont, and which is where I wanted to make my next film. So I knew that it potentially was not the most stable institution, but it at least provided a way for me to sort of usher me back into Vermont.
What courses did you teach?
Let's see, I taught screenwriting courses in both long form and feature length, short form and feature length screenwriting. I taught basic and introductory, intermediate, advanced production courses in documentary and narrative. I did independent studies for some of the graduating students, doing their capstone work, creative producing, editing. Yeah, pretty much basically soup to nuts, as I say.
Do you have favorite courses to teach?
Well, I really enjoy producing. The process of, it's one thing to have all the ideas in the world, but then to actually see them manifest, I find is very rewarding and very challenging. So, and I don't think you can just be the reclusive artist on the hilltop with all the ideas. I also think you have to be engaging in very real, very tangible ways, at least in terms of filmmaking. So I like to teach producing, to train students to be able to distill their ideas down, to be able to communicate effectively, and to be able to be articulate about their work and why it matters, and to also package their projects in a way that can ensure that they get made.
You've also given workshops and had residencies at other colleges. What have been some of the more interesting ones for you?
Well, it's nice to go back to Emerson, my alma mater, and do some guest lecturing in independent producing, business concepts for media. I was just there about a month ago for an intermediate 16mm production course. So it's really nice to be able to go into film classes again, where they're still teaching film. I still love to shoot on 16 or 35mm film, opposed to digital video. So it's always nice to go into a classroom where they're starting to get into film technology.
What do you feel are the more important parts of your teaching? What are some fundamental ideas, and what are some fundamental ideas you want your students to understand about films and filmmaking?
Well, the biggest thing is that students are producing work that's meaningful to them, that it's not just sort of derivative works inspired by, you know, this filmmaker or that film, but that they really tap into other interests outside of filmmaking, that I want them to explore the things, whether it's their personal histories, their family histories, their own hobbies or interests, anything outside of filmmaking that in some way can inspire their process. And so to ensure that they are telling stories that only they can tell.
Yeah.
I find that to be the most important thing, that students are producing original, personal work that, you know, maybe in some ways inspired by other filmmakers, but ultimately it's something that only they could, a story that only they could tell.
What people or experiences would you say have influenced you in your life as a teacher?
Well, you know, Michelle Moise from the Center for Digital Art in Brattleboro, Vermont, I mean, to have this exposure early on, you know, in high school, to his teachings, and he introduced me to, you know, Tarkovsky and Bergman, and so he played a pretty big role. I'd even credit David Holzapfel, who put on, you know, Ren and Stimpy and forced us to, you know, get in front of the classroom and constantly try to, you know, whether it's doing some, you know, you know, reiterating the, you know, multiplication times tables or telling a story in front of the classroom. I find that his sort of teachings had a purpose and also helped me become a producer. So I'll credit the early guys,
Yeah.
who really got in there.
What are some of the parts of teaching that you like?
Yeah, well, I like to just be in the classroom and to be supporting and challenging one another.
Yeah.
And so the expectation that students are to produce, to get results, to create, and doing so in a way where they are being thoughtful and deliberate and are working very hard at it.
Are there parts that you dislike or find less than pleasant, but you do because the jobs require you to do them?
Well, I find what's hardest is that if a student is I think film is very attractive. I think everyone loves film and the idea of film, but to actually do it is something else. It requires a lot of work. And so I always find it can be very hard when a student gets into a film course and is not prepared for the amount of work. And it just, if they're really not invested for the right reasons. So that can always be a challenge. But, and also, I don't know, the downside of teaching, I think, you know, that it's all about, I certainly, the idea of grading a creative work I find to be a bit silly. I think ultimately it's about effort, and it shows too. You know, it's whether a student is really invested for the right reasons. I find that to be, that can be the thing that makes my job harder or easier.
Being an independent artist is often difficult. Have you ever considered giving up?
Yeah, well, that might be fleeting feelings, but yeah, I think every day you can sort of go through feelings of, you know, you have doubts and insecurities, and you get tired and you run up credit card debt, and so yeah, there are always instances where you're, you know, it's a long, hard road, but in some ways you're also you're doing the thing that you're most passionate about. So, you know, as much as you feel, there are times where you feel really disheartened and, you know, frustrated, that sort of pales in comparison to the alternative, which is to, if you abandon it, then you're sort of giving up on the thing that you care most about. So those are fleeting feelings at the end of the day, and you just keep going.
What are some of the personal characteristics that a filmmaker should have?
Well, you should certainly be passionate. You should be resourceful. You should also be tenacious, to not give up. And you should also be willing to put yourself out there and really be able to be your own best advocate to be able to get your work done, because there's really no hand-holding in it. You have to make the case for why your story needs to exist, and if you're going to be relying on other people to help you do that, whether it's actors or subjects in a documentary or a crew, you need to be articulate and passionate and a cheerleader, and to be able to wear lots of hats, not just one of the artists, but one who can be sort of emotionally equipped to deal with all sorts of people and personalities.
Mm-hmm. Do you work on more than one film at a time?
Yes and no. It's sometimes I have a tendency, I sort of go over this very relentless pursuit of one project and sort of put all my eggs in that basket, and then I sort of burn out, and then I sort of have to hop onto another project and then come back. So I wish and I hope that maybe it's someday I'm able to juggle more projects at once. I think that would be a luxury. So no, I have a tendency to really focus on one singular project at a time. Of course, I have a lot of ideas, but in terms of pursuing a project from sort of conception through completion, I have a tendency to just dedicate myself to one project at a time.
Would you describe your current film project, Caregivers? Where is the project at along the line of its creation?
Mm-hmm. Well, Caregivers is a film that I've been wanting to tell for over a decade. And it was a Vermont story, and it was about a social worker to care for another elderly woman, and looking for closure, and sort of carrying a lot of grief and guilt and shame around his own mother's death and his role in that. And the story has since taken on a much more documentary approach, where I've sort of done away with the conventions of narrative and am willing to embrace a much more adaptive approach, a more documentary approach to telling that story.
Yeah. Making documentaries is one part of your work. Running the business part of it is another. Have you learned to run the business and promotional parts of the Lanterna film company?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to be your own best advocate and certainly be willing to ring the bells. So if you receive an award or are presenting at a certain festival, for years I've been putting out a newsletter, you know, whether it's monthly or quarterly, just sharing with friends, family, fans, whoever is interested, the happenings of me, of my films, and so yeah, I find that you have to be able to advocate for your film projects. It can be very challenging to try to monetize your work. There's not much of a market, certainly, for short form films, but you find ways to support yourself and to be able to get your films out there.
What are some of the ways you sell your work?
Well, in order to be able to make the films, you know, I've done these film tours where I present my short films and talk about the next project, and present a lot of archive materials that are related to the film. So one of the biggest challenges as a filmmaker is how you present a work that doesn't exist yet. and so I present my other works and all sorts of other materials related to the new project.
About how much of your time is spent on the business and promotional parts of your job, and how much is on the actual filmmaking?
Yeah, well, you try to restore that balance. Sometimes it feels like you're putting everything you have into the film making, the process of making the film, and then you have to think about fundraising, and so you quickly have to scramble and put your fundraiser hat on. So I'd like to say 50-50, but sometimes it's 80-20 both ways. I mean, I love to spend 80% of my time focusing on the film work, finding my collaborators and doing the work, and then you sort of go into a panic and, put the rest of your time into fundraising. So sometimes it's 80-20 both ways. So I wish it were a bit more balanced in that regard.
If there was such a thing as typical, would you please describe a typical day of filmmaking as the Black Canarys from when you got up until you finished your day?
Well, there's 3 phases of the filmmaking process, just generally speaking, from pre-production, before the filmmaking takes place, the production, and then the post-production. So, in the case of Black Canarys and the day in the making of the actual making of the film, a production day, which was about 9 days, we shot in November. We're talking 16-hour days, so you wake up very early and you have a coffee. There's always plenty of coffee, and you have a meal with your cast and crew. And then you basically have a schedule, and you try to stay on schedule and produce your shots and shoot your scenes. And so you're always racing against a clock, and it can be very hard because there's all sorts of compromises, and you're battling the weather, and it's a very demanding day. But that's also sort of flash in the pan, where everyone comes together to make the film, and then it's over, and then you move into post-production editing, and you're generally on your own there. So,
Generally speaking, what is the amount of time spent on filming on location versus the amount of time you spent on post-production?
Yeah. Well, in the case of Black Canarys, it was, I'd say 9 days of actual principal photography, where there's a cast and crew. A few days of pickups, so 2 days of pickups where you're getting additional material. That so all said and done, about 9 days in production, but then almost, I would say, on and off about 1.5 years in the editing process. And then prior to that, about 4 months of pre-production, of getting all of your cast and your crew and the locations and whatnot.
Well, I've seen over my time of when I make a video, because I have a YouTube channel and I keep videos going and everything like that.
Yeah.
And it'll take me sometimes just literally 4 minutes to make the video, but then afterwards for the editing part of it, it could take me up to an hour of it.
Yeah, the editing is generally a lot more time consuming.
In what way does your production phase of filmmaking inform the post-production work and vice versa?
Well, I think that films are made in the editing room, because that's really where you see the film come to life, and also it means that it becomes very real at that point, where you're working with material that you've foraged out in the field. You've amassed all of this raw material, and then you have to make sense of it. And so you have your original vision or a screenplay that you've written, and then you have the production where you try to stick to that screenplay, but I think inevitably you adapt and you compromise, and sometimes you don't film everything you intended to film, or certain scenes don't work that you thought where they thought they might. And so it's really in the editing, the post-production, where you start to see the film come to life, and that's a very exciting part of the process. But it also means you don't play sacred to any of the material, that you have to come at the material with fresh eyes, and that's generally what informs the process.
What are some parts of your work that you especially like?
I really love pre-production, of getting it all together. So whatever the production requires, it means you're going out there and meeting folks face to face, and introducing yourself and the project, and trying to get it off the ground. And so you create this whole world around the project, and that's very exciting to see. And then the post-production process, of course, is very rewarding, because then you start to see the film come together in its final form.
Yeah. Are there parts of your job that you dislike but have to do?
Yeah, well, the fundraising can be very tiresome, of course. I think a lot of filmmakers wish they just had the budget that they need to do the work, but most don't have that luxury. And so, I wish I could dedicate myself entirely to just making the films, but raising money is also a big part of that. And so, yeah, that can be very tiresome, and it can be very hard to raise money for films, and so, but it's an essential part of the process, and you just have to accept and embrace that, and so I do that.
In your opinion, what are some of the difficulties that you and independent filmmakers face today?
Well, it seems to have gotten harder in one way, because we have this proliferation of all of these new streaming platforms, right? That people aren't going to the movies as much anymore, and you have so much more content being produced. So in some ways, you have these platforms that can get your films out to a very wide audience, but because there's so much content, they're not paying that much anymore. And then also, audiences aren't really going out to the theaters anymore. They're just signing up for these subscription services and watching from home. And so in some ways, it just, there's more competition than there's ever been. There's less dollars than there's ever been. And studios are producing generally these big blockbuster tentpole films. And so you don't really you don't see a lot of the independent films that you may have seen in the early to late 90s, where there was a lot of independent filmmakers producing a lot of exciting work. A lot of them have gone to episodic content and television, which in some ways is having its own sort of golden era for independent filmmakers today.
What do you see as your future of your work and Lanterna film here in Marlboro?
Well, right now I'm focused on caregivers, which I imagine this is a project that I'll be producing over the next 3 years at least. And so when that's complete, the idea is you take it to film festivals, and I'm working with the Vermont Symphony Orchestra, and so the idea is to present the film with a live orchestra. And this is one way where you can create an experience where it's not just something that you can watch in your own living room, but actually have a first-hand, one-of-a-kind experience with a live orchestra, something that can't be duplicated.
What people or experiences would you say have influenced you in your personal life, and in what ways have they influenced you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
People or experiences in my life that have influenced me. Well, I have to first credit my parents. I mean, they both, for my brother and I, they never dissuaded us from pursuing a life in the arts. I never once heard, oh, maybe you should do something more practical. So for them to give me that encouragement, for better or worse, they never dissuaded me, and so I credit them a great deal. But I also credit my teachers, especially at Marlboro Elementary, where again, they saw that I had an interest and they encouraged me. And that encouragement is so important, to feel supported by your friends and your family and your peers in the work. And so I've had a lot of filmmaker friends, my parents and teachers that have always encouraged me, and that goes a long way.
What are some of your interests outside of filmmaking?
Music. In some ways, I'm not as much of a cinephile. I'm not always just watching new content. So I find I prefer to turn the television off, and I listen to a lot of music. I'm a bit more of an audiophile than I am a cinephile. So I'm always collecting music and records and trying to sort of uncover new or old artists. And then also photography, and doing a lot of genealogical research is also a big part of my process, and something that I enjoy personally and that I find informs the work.
Alright, is there anything else about your life that you'd like to mention that I haven't talked about yet?
Well, I'll just say it's nice to be back in Marlboro, Vermont after 13 years, and we're in the process of buying a home here. And it's been hard to transition back in and try to establish a footing, but this is a place that's near and dear to me, and I'm just happy to be back and be part of David's Work in Marlboro project, which I think is a really cool project, and I wish I had it when I was younger, but in some ways it feels like I have, because I've been continuing in this sort of fashion for many years.
Alright. Thank you very much for your time.
Nice job. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks, guys.